Next up, I'd like to welcome Mike Kelly. He's Senior Vice President of CMC at Atsena Therapeutics. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Ben. Nice to be here.
Would you mind giving a brief bio for the audience?
Sure. So as you said, I'm working at Atsena Therapeutics currently. Atsena is a startup company focusing on AAV gene therapy for inherited retinal diseases, ophthalmology, 100%. Prior to that, I've had a number of roles in smaller and larger companies in lentivirus and AAV gene therapy, as well as some ex vivo cell therapy work as well. I sort of mirrored Jim's experience. I've been doing this for since the mid 90s. So I've seen it come and go a number of times. But I've been in research, development, and CMC areas throughout that time.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So I wanted to start off at the beginning, thinking about a clear strategy. I wonder, can you please explain for the audience how you'd recommend going about developing a strategy for make versus buy decisions, and why hope is not a viable strategy?
Yeah. So Jim and Susan did a really nice job at explaining just how complicated what we do is. And obviously, it's important when we transition into the CMC realm that we understand how to do it, that we understand the technology and how to apply technology and meet the regulatory expectations that hopefully will get us an approved therapeutic. Just in general, make versus buy is not unique to CMC. I mean, every company, there's no such thing as a virtual company. Everybody has to depend on service providers in some way, shape, or form. And so therefore, every company in our space as a core competency has to have the tools to do outsourcing as well as insourcing operations. So it's really important that they know how to identify, how to evaluate, and select vendors that are really well matched with those technical and operational needs, and that for those that can really convert the techno that Susan very eloquently described into operational strategies, because it's really important. There's a number of very small companies using outsourced services. It's really important that both parties come together to enable the rapid and efficient transition into the clinic and eventually out of the clinic. And it's really important for all of these small companies to be successful, to do it in a cost-effective way. So,
yeah, I guess where I'd go next then is, do you have a quick mental rubric that you might use where you're thinking about identifying, evaluating, selecting vendors, and at what point you go from one column to the other, make versus buy?
yeah. So, obviously, most small companies don't have the option of building internal capability up front. That's a very significant investment, both in terms of dollars as well as time. So, obviously, leveraging the existing infrastructure that exists is really important. Selecting those vendors is just as important. I think we've come through a number of years where the demand for outsourced services is just huge, and certainly has outstripped the capability of that infrastructure. And so choosing who to work with, I think you really need to understand how their experience matches your needs. I also think it's really important that you understand clearly what your needs are, because if you don't have a clear understanding, it's going to be difficult to make a good selection. I think there's a number of factors to consider. Obviously, every company has programs with schedules and expectations, but I think you really need to understand the fit between the sponsor and the service provider in terms of technical capability, operational capability, experience, management experience, how you solve and work through problems. There's a number of things that you have to consider. I think it's important to understand, number one, that you can't just hand it over to a CMO. That's one of the hard things when you're giving a program to a CMO, is you're giving them essentially all of the control, but you still carry 100% of the accountability. So you've got to ask the questions, identify who can and who can't, It's and not to be disrespectful to CMOs, but they do a pretty good job at marketing and selling services. Obviously, that needs to be matched with operational capability, and I think that's where companies that are very stretched in terms of demand don't always have the ability to sort of meet the promises around timeline and technical capability, nor should we expect them to. So I think it's really important that we understand that as a sponsor, we own the process and we own the accountability, and we need to leverage them for their skills, but we can't depend on them just to give us the answer. So, I think it's complicated. I think you need to really understand what they can do for you, understand the risks associated with it, understand where you can have misalignments and miscommunications. I think also just understanding that there's forums and environments where you can really have good conversations and good escalation processes to make sure that everyone is working in the same direction.
I think that's a perfect segue too. So our next bullet, let's think about right sizing. So it's possible, and it frequently occurs, that CMC investments can be overkill. So how would you go about ensuring that your investments deliver what they need to deliver, no more and no less, so that they do exactly what regulators want to see?
So that's interesting. So investing in CMC is a risk-based proactive activity, right? We have to do it early in order to be ready to meet program needs on time. One of the things that scares me is this idea that you're trying to get it just right, because it's not always easy to predict what the expectations are going to be 2, 3 years down the road. So this idea of getting it just right and not over-investing is a risky proposition, because if you get it wrong, you certainly don't want to end up on the wrong side of the line. I think it's really important to understand the technical and regulatory expectations, and I think there are forums to get there. I think scientific advice meetings are really important. It allows you to really propose your strategy and get feedback from regulators and understand what those expectations truly are. In the last number of years, we've had significant improvements in technology. Jim and Susan talked a lot about that. We've also had a number of large pharmas come to the table and really help push CMC capability forward. But in parallel to that, the bar is being raised. We're seeing new guidances come out all the time, and I think the FDA and the agencies in general are holding sponsors to a higher level. And this idea of continuous improvement. So I think it's important that we don't come up short. I think if you're going to make a mistake, you're probably better to be a little over than a little under. But I think it's important to sort of keep an eye on where the field is, ask questions, find forums to keep up to date. Conferences, engagements like this can be helpful. Understand what the field is looking for and make sure that you don't come up light. But overall, I think it's the onus is on the sponsor to know what the needs are and make sure that you're ready to meet those expectations.
Great. Now, can you recommend best practices for scalability considerations to transition from operations to transition operations from R&D to clinical?
Yeah, so this is obviously a pretty big area for discussion. I think it's important to recognize that if CMC are coming in to the R&D process late in the life cycle, it's too late. I think it's really important that CMC are engaged as a partner in the R&D process and can really inform and educate in terms of what transitions are going to look like. It's really important that the platforms and the analytics that are used to credential programs are not a mystery. And in an ideal scenario, you're not going to have different product quality and different analytical methods to support those decisions. In an ideal scenario, R&D would be using the platform methods both for production and testing that CMC will eventually be putting in place. That's not always easy to do because CMC is an evolving capability, but I think it's really important that you don't have comparability challenges. I mean, someone else, I think Jim might have mentioned this earlier, to make sure that you're not getting different results. Product comparability is important all the way through the life cycle. Um,
Mm,
I think it's also important that you understand the impact of making changes on technical capability downstream. Even something as simple as the formulation that the research folks use, if it's different, you may get a different result. I mean, understanding what the route of administration needs are going to be and making sure that we're using the right tools just demystifies those transitions and comparability components. So I would say get the CMC process in place as early as possible, certainly no later than the non-clinical studies that are using to credential the program, but be a partner, be on the team, and be in there early.
excellent. 3 great points. So are there then, in your estimation, best ways to improve technology platforms and assay designs to better support operational strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the starting point there is to understand what the platform needs to deliver and what improvements and what benefits you're trying to achieve.
Hmm.
I think that's, it's very easy to apply new technologies, but it's important to know what you're trying to achieve. Whether that's removing animal-derived components or improve purity or improve yield or improve the accuracy and precision of your methods. I think it's important to know what you're trying to achieve there. One of the things is it's never good enough, and sometimes you have to make a decision on the timing of when you're ready to make a commitment. But I think all of this is really based on an understanding of what the process needs to deliver and what the product quality attributes are, and understanding the CQAs of the process, understanding the CPPs and KPPs of your process that drive those performances. And I think looking at this idea of design for manufacturability, knowing what eventually you need to have in place in order to ensure robust operations. So, I think technology for technology's sake is probably a risk, but I think
Mm,
understanding the rationale for why you're making changes and have ways and means to measure the effectiveness of those improvements in the platform, I think it will go a long way.
yeah.
I think it's also important. One final point is to make sure that eventually your tools have to be validated, whether that's a process validation or an analytical validation. And I think it's important to recognize that you're building capability that will fit that validation need.
Yeah, great point. Now, to get to all of these points in the process as things mature, COGS, cost of goods sold, are an ever-present reality. Any thoughts come to mind on best ways of controlling COGS?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think to control COGS, you have to understand what components make up COGS. So when a lot of people in CMC talk about COGS, they talk about the cost of goods manufactured. And that's certainly a big component of COGS, but COGS also includes storage and distribution, and more importantly, licensing. So companies, when they license programs or license technologies, usually make royalty commitments as part of that. So that's all got to be considered in terms of the cost of goods sold. Um, it's also really important to understand what reimbursement strategies and reimbursement capabilities exist. So, one of the challenges we're struggling with today is particularly with those high demand programs where we've got weight-based dosing and some patients require E15, E16 particles. That's a pretty expensive proposition. It's important to know that we can meet those costs, which I don't think we can today, but to be commercially viable, we got to get there. There's some easy things you can look at, like improving productivity, reducing the use or reliance on expensive materials, recycling expensive materials like chromatography columns. I think that they'll all get you so far, but I think ultimately you have to really look orthogonally at all the components that determine and drive cost. Product yield, cycle time in manufacturing suites. And again, going back to this make versus buy scenario, typically it's less expensive to manufacture internally if you have a sustainable need for supply of materials. That's one of the things when you go back to your make versus buy strategies, you may decide for commercial that you want to internalize it because there's cost advantages to doing that. But also understanding infrastructure, running manufacturing and testing facilities is expensive. The capacity utilization of those of that infrastructure needs to be considered, because if you're not leveraging it efficiently, you may be overpaying. And one last point, which I think is really important, is products in cell and gene therapy that are administered one time. There is a one-time sale. And so when we think about supply dynamics, we think a lot about the prevalence population and the incidence population. So if you've got a situation where you're meeting patient demand, there's no repeat supply. So we can model what we think it will take for an approved therapeutic to successfully catch up on patients that are in the prevalence population, but eventually the demand for those materials is going to go down. So understanding how you're going to transition to a discontinuation of supply and the impact that has on overhead, I think is important as well. These are not typically the kind of things that we talk about in sort of early development, but I think when we think about transitioning to commercialization, a lot of the principles that are established based on biologics are based on a continuous supply of drug to patients, typically for their lifetime. Obviously, the dynamics we have in one-time administration is changing that, and we need to be cognizant of that in our approach.
Mm-hmm. And I guess especially in cases where you're looking at rare and orphan diseases, whereby the prevalence could be matched, or the demand matching could happen in the forecast model relatively quickly compared to, let's say, other disease states.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously we need to consider the adoption of these therapies, these novel therapies in those patient populations, but that's absolutely correct.
Brilliant. Can you share any parting thoughts on building a commercially feasible program profile?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is a little bit speculative, but obviously, the question is, what are the hallmarks of a commercially successful program? Obviously, we need to be able to get reimbursed for drugs with an appropriate business model and an appropriate margin. Companies need to be compensated for the risk taking in drug development in the first place. And that's difficult. I think working with payers and understanding what reimbursement models exist is an important component. I think it's also important to understand the label that you get with drugs and how you design clinical studies to get a very maximal label. You certainly, especially in orphan and rare diseases, don't want to be getting a label that only allows you to treat a subset of those patients. So you really got to try to bring these programs forward to all patients and also all territories, making sure that you've got a global view when you run these clinical trials in order to get a full advantage from these programs. There's other financial components to think about, like reimbursement. Everyone talks about the $1 million, or now I guess the $3 and $4 million gene therapy product, but there may be a scenario where we don't get those drugs paid for in a single payment. There may be annuity models where we get paid over a certain number of years based on maintaining the therapeutic benefit in patients. There's a number of things that I think we need to work with payers on to understand how we get there. But ultimately, commercialization it's going to look a lot like the biologics world, but with the big difference that you're selling this product one time in the life of a patient. Or at least that's what we hope. It's also important that patients will adopt and take these drugs. One of the things that we always think about on commercialization is how will the launch go? How will a new drug be adopted in the marketplace? And sometimes, people overestimate patients' need or desire to take a pretty new drug. Sometimes patients might say, well, I'm going to wait for 5 years because I'm not going to die. I want to see a little bit more data before I take this novel approach. So there's some things around understanding that. I think that can be enhanced by working with patient advocacy groups, understanding how to get communication and education to patients to understand the benefits of these drugs. But I think it's important that we design the studies to give ourselves as much benefit and much capability that allows payers to really reimburse appropriately. I don't think we're there today. You know, I think there's still a lot of work to be done because these are big numbers that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, good points there, Mike. We got a question that came in regarding COGS, going back to that. How does the generation of a producer cell line impact the evolving CMC for a program?
So a producer cell line is just a different way of making a vector. There's a hypothetical, maybe not hypothetical, but there is this concept that it's more scalable and more cost effective. I think ultimately it turns into how many patient doses per batch can you make, and how does that productivity impact the cost of goods. So if you've got a producer cell line that's producing at a very high level and a very robust level, I think there can be advantages. But I think it still comes down to what is the cost per dose, and is there an advantage of doing that? I'm certainly familiar with some cell lines that have produced incredibly well. I think there's also some cell lines that maybe haven't really been that much better than transfection. But the other thing to consider is the producer cell line available in a timely fashion? One of the challenges that we've faced in the past is it's taken multiple years to engineer and select these cell lines, and there's a cost ramification to that. But I mean, the hope is that a cell line will give us higher productivity and more robust production levels than conventional methods.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Thanks, Mike, for spending time with me here today and sharing your thoughts. Thank you to Jim, Susan, and Mike for their brilliant input today. And I think everyone in the audience would agree, truly some incredible and remarkable discussions and expertise on display here. And I really can't underscore that enough. So this is where I summon Brian back to the stage to welcome everyone to the Open Networking event up next. Thank you, everyone.
Ben, thank you very much. And I'll concur with your final thoughts there, that you guys did not disappoint at all. I mean, quite amazing conversations. I mean, unique insight and perspective. So we appreciate that. Jim, Susan, Mike, thank you very much for helping pay it forward. And Ben, hey, thanks for helping us show the way. So I know we didn't get to a lot of questions that we want to, and there's a chance for us to network, here and kind of get together. So in a second here, we're going to move everybody over into the networking so we can kind of reconnect, follow up with questions, continue the conversation. So we're going to move you into that room in a second. Remember, you just need to double click on a chair to move from table to table to join a conversation. The speakers will be located at the center tables on the networking floor. So make sure you get around the room and get your questions in. Again, I'd like to thank Center for Breakthrough Medicines and Pendotech for being our main sponsors here today. All the presentations will be available on demand shortly. We're also going to convert everything into PDF articles, into podcasts, and also ebooks. So look out for those. And if you'd like to take a look at what Evaluating Biopharma has done in the past and what events we have coming up, just go to evaluatingbiopharma.com. So thanks again. We're going to move right into networking now. Appreciate it. Enjoy networking. Let's get the most out of the time that we have here together. Okay. Thanks, guys.